Funding for this program is provided by the National Institute of Justice.
Function of 19 years in Texas Department of Corrections.
Hello, I'm James Wilson. Often life imitates art. When a dramatic event is reported in the media, people may try to emulate it. After Marilyn Monroe committed suicide, about 300 more suicides occurred than usual. After John F. Kennedy was shot, the number of violent crimes seemed to increase. And after newspaper and television accounts of a heavyweight prize fight, the number of homicides seems to increase. These effects tend to be short-lived, however. What may not be short-lived is the effect of being exposed while growing up to a heavy diet of televised violence. Twice, government-sponsored panels issued reports asserting that television violence and actual violence are linked. The latest report said the evidence was, quote, overwhelming, unquote. But many other experts are not so certain. They criticize the methods used in this research. There is not much doubt that there is a correlation between the aggressiveness of children and how much television they watch. What is at issue is whether watching violence causes aggression over the long run. And if it does, how much of this violence can be attributed to the media? Here to discuss this are Professor David Phillips of the University of California at San Diego, Professor L. Raoul Huesman of the University of Illinois at Chicago, and Dr. J. Ronald Malofsky, Vice President for News and Social Research at the National Broadcasting Company. David Phillips, you did the study that seemed to find that the number of suicides after Marilyn Monroe's death increased. Just how did you do this?
Well, I collected a systematic set of all publicized suicide stories in the period since the Second World War. I got monthly suicide statistics from the National Center for Health Statistics, and I looked to see whether the number of suicides in the month after the publicized suicide story was abnormally high.
Now, what do you mean by abnormally high? What would be the normal number of suicides?
Well, I can tell you how I did this in the case of Marilyn Monroe's story. She killed herself at the beginning of August 1962. In order to discover whether the number of suicides in August of 1962 is abnormally high, I compared it with the number of suicides in August of 1961 and the number of suicides in August of 1963. I did the same procedure for all the other suicide stories as well.
So you were making a comparison much of the same sort that a corporation would make when it decides whether it had abnormally high or low profits in a given month. It compares its experience that month with a similar
And the government
month.
does this too.
What happened after the assassination of John F. Kennedy?
Well, this was a study done by another researcher which apparently showed that the number of robberies increased just afterwards, but the number of murders apparently did not increase just after Kennedy's assassination.
Now, why would robberies go up but not murders go up?
I don't know. I think in that other particular study, only 2 heavily publicized murder stories were examined, and the results of that study may be just a fluke because of only 2 stories being looked at.
Now, you've also found, or appear to have found, that when there's a heavyweight championship prize fight that is televised, that the number of murders goes up within a short period of time after that. Could you explain in more detail how you learned that?
Yes, I chose to look at heavyweight championship prize fights because these are stories in which violence is heavily rewarded and justified. Sometimes the fighter gets $2 million for trying to knock another person unconscious. We know in the laboratory that people behave more aggressively after seeing prize fights. I wanted to see in the real world whether this happened also. I got daily homicide statistics for the period 1973 through 1979. There was more than 140,000 homicides. And I corrected for the effect of day of the week and seasons and other things on these homicides, and found that just after these heavyweight championship prize fights, homicides increased significantly, particularly after prize fights which get a great deal of news play.
Now, many of these prize fights are seen only on closed-circuit television, not on the general broadcast media. Doesn't that sort of restrict the size of the audience? Why would closed-circuit broadcasting have an effect?
Well, I think that people learn about prize fights in many different ways, from newspapers, from radio, from talking to friends, from magazines, from a very wide variety of sources. We don't know which of these sources is having the greatest impact, but we do know that after these prize fights in general, homicides increase, not just after the ones that are in closed-circuit television.
As I recall your study, you seem to find that the increase in homicides occurred on a particular day. As I recall, it was 3 or 4 days after the prize fight.
That's correct.
Why would it occur on those days rather than immediately thereafter?
Well, one possible reason may be that I'm looking at the date of the homicidal death, not the date of the homicidal attack, which may occur 2 or 3 days earlier. So that people may attack each other just after the prize fight, but the person may die only 2 or 3 days afterwards, after the attack.
And is there a clear correlation between the amount of publicity the prize fight gets and the increase in homicides?
Well, prize fights which are covered in the network evening news, which tend to be the more publicized prize fights, have a much larger increase in homicides than prize fights which don't make it to the network evening news.
Now, would you describe this as an imitative effect and largely a short-lived effect?
It is very short-lived. It lasts, within 4 days the effect is gone.
I see.
One other thing which suggests that there is some imitative effect going on, however, is that the kind of person killed just after the prize fight is similar to the person who was beaten in the prize fight.
Similar in what?
Well, for example, if a young white male is beaten in the prize fight, the murders of young white males go up significantly, but not the murders of young black males.
Let me ask Ron Malofsky what he thinks of these findings. Do you accept these conclusions? Do you have any problems with them?
Well, I have some problems with them, yes. We have taken Professor Phillips' work very seriously, so seriously that we spent quite a lot of time investigating one of his other studies, because television was more directly involved in that one, that involved suicides on soap operas, and also a magical 3-day lag until real-life suicides increased. And we investigated that and found that Professor Phillips had made a mistake in his data and that lag does not exist.
That was on the suicides in soap operas?
In soap operas. We did not go through the trouble, which is a great deal of trouble, to replicate the prize fight study, but I still have questions about it. There are other people who are investigating and trying to replicate those studies, and his work is taken seriously. We are following it very closely. I just wonder whether all the factors that should have been controlled in the prize fight study were in fact controlled.
Let me turn to Raul Hisman. What is your reaction to David Phillips's findings? Are these consistent with your understanding or not?
Well, they're consistent with the theory that we have about how television violence affects children. Whether or not the particular findings are ones that will hold up in the long run, it's too early to say. The essence of science is replication. And I think what we're going to have to do is wait and see whether these findings can be replicated. I think it would be a mistake to put too much emphasis on any single study, my own studies or Professor Phillips' studies or anyone else's. I think what's impressive in this area is the congruence of the large number of studies that implicate television violence and media violence in general as having a role in stimulating aggressive behavior.
You mentioned the congruence of many kinds of studies. Let me make a statement to the audience and see if you agree with it, because I'd like to turn to one particular kind of study. There's not much doubt that there are many ways to study the effects of the media on people. You can do it in the laboratory by showing people televised clips and see if whether right afterwards they behave in a more aggressive manner. Or you can look at the kind of natural experiments occurring in the world that David Phillips did. But probably the best way to find out whether long-term exposure to television violence actually causes more violence is to do what scholars call a longitudinal panel study. Now, longitudinal simply means that the study is done over time. And panel simply means that you study the same people over time. So in a longitudinal panel study, as I understand it, you take a group of persons, let's say elementary school boys or junior high school boys, and measure their exposure to television and measure their aggressiveness at one point in time, and then continue doing these measures over time for the same boys for 3, 4, 5 years to see whether watching television above and beyond their normal level of aggressiveness seems, as the years go by, to increase the level of aggressiveness that they display. Would you say this is a fair characterization of a longitudinal panel study?
Yes,
I see heads being nodded. All right, let me turn then to Raoul Huesman, who has done one or two of the most important longitudinal panel studies. What did you study and what did you find?
Well, in one of the studies, beginning in 1960, we began testing the entire third grade population of one county in New York State. And now we've followed these children for 22 years. And what we've found is that those children who were watching more television violence when they were 8 years, 9 years old in 1960, 10 years later, were behaving more aggressively than other children. And 22 years later, when they were young adults, actually had been convicted of more serious crimes and of more crimes than other comparable children.
Now, it's fair to say that you have found a strong correlation. How do you know whether television viewing actually caused this higher level of aggression or possibly even criminality?
Well, no one can ever tell from even from a longitudinal field study for certain whether causation is unidirectional or bidirectional. Laboratory studies have to be involved to test that. However, there are some things one can do. One can statistically equate for initial levels of aggression. In other words, compare children who are at about the same level of aggression initially and see if those children who watched more television violence then behave more aggressively at a later time. We've done that, and the data we find suggests that that is in fact the case.
Let me pause and ask you to explain to the viewer what kind of programs you deem to be violent when the children were watching them and what kinds of programs you deem to be nonviolent. For example, did you consider a program featuring football or hockey or prize fighting to be violent or nonviolent?
No, sports shows were not coded into this analysis in either direction. What we did is we used only shows that we could reach consensus among a number of different raters that these shows clearly were violent or nonviolent.
Give
so
me
for
an example.
An example of a violent show back in 1960 would have, that time would have been 77 Sunset Strip. The adult westerns have Gun Will Travel, Gunsmoke. Examples of nonviolent shows that time or somewhat later would be family situation comedies, those type of shows.
How did you code cartoons that children see?
Cartoons were coded, some were coded as violent, some as nonviolent.
Give me an example.
Roadrunner cartoon, coded as a violent cartoon.
This is where Wile E. Coyote always meets his end. That's a violent. What is a nonviolent cartoon?
Let's see, probably an example of a nonviolent cartoon would be one of the cartoon features that doesn't involve any violence, such as some of the Walt Disney cartoon features. Those would certainly be coded as nonviolent. What we're really interested in is examples of interpersonal aggression graphically displayed on the screen, one individual or person violently aggressing
now,
against another.
in the school setting, when you were following these people as they grew up, how did you define their aggression? What was aggressive behavior in your study?
Okay, well, I think that's another very important thing to understand. As you pointed out at the start, there's general agreement that there is a relation between violence viewing and aggressive behavior. And this aggressive behavior has normally been measured exactly the way we did by using things such as peer nominations. You ask the children's peers in school who starts fights over nothing, who pushes and shoves other children, things like that. One of the things we found in this 22-year study is that those types of behaviors, which some critics have said only represent nastiness or boisterousness, in fact are highly predictive of adult criminality. Those children who are rated as most highly aggressive at 8 years old on those behaviors are the children who as adults are most likely to be arrested for serious crimes.
Thank you. Let me turn now to Ron Milofsky. You also have done a major longitudinal panel study in association with various colleagues. What did you do and what did you find?
Well, our design of our study was very similar to the design that Raoul described in his part of the discussion. We also used the same sort of measure of of aggression that he used, a peer rating measure. As a matter of fact, our measure was patterned after one that was developed by some of his colleagues. We followed children over a 3-year period, and we also looked at the relationship between exposure to violent programming at an earlier time period and change in aggression over various lags over the 3-year period.
And what did you find?
We found that we were surprised to find that, number one, the cross-sectional correlations were not anywhere near as strong as we anticipated that they would be.
Pause.
Yes.
A cross-sectional correlation is what?
The relationship between exposure to violence and aggressive behavior at one point in time.
So that correlation is high if a person watching television is himself aggressive.
Aggressive, and if a person not watching television is
not aggressive. Okay. This correlation tended to be, you said, high or low?
Well, it was not as high as, we anticipated it might be when we went into the study. At that time, there were not very many correlational studies in existence, so we had no reason to expect anything. But we thought, since there was an awful lot of fuss, and because the laboratory experiments had come out the way they came out, that the relationship would be stronger than, in fact, we found. When we looked at the over time data, controlled by, for prior aggression, we found that the numbers were very, very tiny. The most that could be said is that they were not exactly 0, they were on the positive side of 0, meaning that there was a slight tendency for those who were exposed to be somewhat more aggressive later on, but nothing was, nothing passed the criterion that you would want to see passed as a social scientist.
Let me ask you about aspects of your study that may differ from Raoul's. First of all, he began his first study in 1960. You began this study in approximately 1970.
Right.
Would that have made a difference? Has television changed, or have children changed, or the circumstances changed over 10 years?
Yes, all those things have changed, and the studies, even Raoul's later study is different from his earlier study, a little bit more precise in some ways. But for example, Raoul's data are from 78 to 81 or something like that in Chicago. Ours are from 70 to 73 in Minneapolis and in Fort Worth, and the data look very, very close.
Now, is there
So
a fundamental
there
difference between you and Raoul with respect to the existence of a correlation between watching television and being aggressive?
I don't think so. I think that...
What is the difference, then?
I think the major difference is that when Raoul looks at things as small as we both have found, he interprets them as an effect.
Now, let me ask him how he gets to that interpretation. Do you accept his description of what he did and what you did and their similarities and differences?
Yes, the only confusing thing here is that I, with my colleagues, have done a number of different studies. And in particular, separate from this 22-year study I was telling you about, in the late 1970s, we began another series of 3-year studies, which were very comparable to the NBC study, which we did in the United States and in 6 other countries as well. In every one of these studies, we found a correlation between violence, viewing, and aggression. That is, more aggressive children watch more violence on television. In most of the countries, we also found the kind of longitudinal effect I described before, that when you controlled for initial level of aggressiveness, children who watched more violence in the first few years behaved more aggressively than you would have expected them to otherwise in the last year. These effects are small. I mean, I agree with Ron completely. The question one has to decide is, just because they're small, does that mean they're unimportant? I mean, if you're talking about 3, 4, 5% of the violence in the United States, when you're talking about 25,000 homicides, you're talking about an effect that may not be small. But even if you're talking about 1%, that's
has your data
arguable.
shed any light, however, on the number of persons who commit homicide as it relates to their exposure to television violence?
Well, the 3-year studies are dealing with children, generally in the age range that are 6 to 11 years old. So it's too early to say. One could follow them up later. But what I can say from the 22-year study is that that study shows that those children who are rated more aggressive on the type of scales we use in this age range, 6 to 11, in fact are convicted of more serious crimes when they're adults.
Let me turn back to Ron Milowski for a moment. Go ahead.
Yes, I just want to clarify one thing. It's not a question of whether small is important or not important. Of course, if small were real, small would be important. What I'm saying is that the numbers are so small we can't be sure that they're even real. In our case, when we introduced some control factors, the positive pattern disappeared even.
Let's pause on that question. When you introduce a control factor, what does that mean? You hold constant the income level of the children,
Yes.
their social background?
Exactly. If you hold that constant, the pattern of positive signs disappears.
Now, what happens when you control for factors like the socio-economic status of the child? Does the positive factor still persist?
The positive factor still persists. When we control for IQ, it diminished somewhat, but is still statistically significant. What we find generally in our replications across country is the importance of these factors vary from country to country, location to location. I think what's important to look at is the overall view of putting together the whole series of studies. Yes, the effects are small, but I believe they are real. These are not artificial findings, not artifacts, but these are real findings, and therefore we need to be concerned about
You heard
them.
David Phillips earlier talk about the kinds of short-term effects he found from the media, and he focused on certain kinds of news stories. You've been focusing on certain kinds of fictional portrayals of violence. Can you say anything about the kind of portrayal that is more or less likely to produce the effects you discovered?
Well, one of the things we've tried to look at, particularly in our more recent studies, is those conditions that make it more likely that a child would imitate what the child sees on television, which is essentially the basis of the developmental psychologist's theoretical view of what's happening. What we found, for example, is that children are more likely to imitate actors whom they view as heroic, powerful actors with whom they can identify, who are engaging in behaviors that seem realistic, about whom they fantasize later. Those are the ones they're most likely to
Give me an
imitate.
example of programs in which this sort of thing
Well,
occurs.
I'll use a movie
All right.
to give you some examples. Certainly a kind of character represented by a Dirty Harry, where you have a heroic police officer,
Clint Eastwood.
engaging in activities that appear to be for the benefit of everyone, at least the way the movie presents it, but using violence, very severe violence to that end, is more likely to influence a child than a horror movie in which you have some terrible violence, but it's clearly perpetrated by someone who meets with approbation by everyone in society and is not held up as an heroic figure.
David, how do the findings of these two gentlemen square with your understanding of what is going on? Ron says he finds a very small, statistically insignificant effect which disappears after he looks at other background factors. Raoul says he finds a small effect which is significant and which doesn't disappear when he looks at other factors. Where do you come down on that?
Well, I think they're studying a very different topic from what I'm studying. They're examining, by and large, mild aggression in children, whereas I'm examining fatal aggression in adults, which is what I think most people are worried about. I'd like to follow up a brief point made by Raoul earlier on the importance of replication. I think that is very important. I'd like to say that...
Let me just pause for a moment. By replication, you mean repeating the same kind of study using the same methods on different subjects.
And finding the same result.
Finding the same thing.
The effect of prize fights has been studied extensively in the laboratory, and it has been found in the laboratory as well as in my study that people behave more aggressively just after seeing prize fights. Also, the effect of suicide stories, publicized suicide stories, has been studied several times since my initial study. And in the subsequent studies, not of fictional suicide stories, but of non-fictional suicide stories, in every case, once again, an increase in suicides was found.
Now, what lessons are we to draw from this? Suppose there is the imitative effect you found, and suppose there's the long-term learning effect you appear to have found. What are we to do? Are we to change by government fiat the content of television programming and films and newspapers, because the research that you did is not limited by any means to television? Or are we simply to wring our hands? Or are we to say, look, these effects are so small that there are far more important causes of violence that society should first address? Let me begin with you, Ron.
That's one of the reasons why we looked into Phillips' research to begin with, is because if it were in fact the case that suicides in daytime serials was a factor in real suicides, we would have attempted, as an internal staff department, to try to influence the programmers within NBC and to have them stop that. That's the way our system works. We don't, we try to avoid any kind of government regulation, and we try to make sure that our own actions are responsible. We would have done that if we had found that this was...
Raul, what implications for policy do you draw from your research?
Well, first of all, our research suggests a model of the development of aggression, which is that during certain critical periods when a child's very young, a child forms habits that persist throughout their life. That suggests several things. First of all, unlike Professor Phillips' research, it focuses our attention mostly on what children are seeing, not on what adults are seeing. Because what we find is that aggressive behavior as an adult is determined to a large extent by habits learned in childhood. Secondly, it focuses attention on some of the factors that make it more likely that a child will be influenced by what's shown. There can be changes other than eliminating violence that may influence whether a child learns aggressive habits from TV. Third, I think it focuses attention on the parent and the family having responsibility in controlling what a child sees to some extent. There are justifiable reasons for having violence of various kinds in dramatic presentations. I don't think one would want it eliminated, but one does not want children at certain ages to be exposed to these.
Let me ask you the following question. Your research has been mostly on fictionalized portrayal of violence. What if it could be shown that it was the actual news programs or coverage of sporting events, such as hockey games, that contributed decisively, much more than the Roadrunner cartoons or the Dirty Harry movies? Are there anything that we can do? It seems to me that the First Amendment reaches at least news broadcasting, perhaps even sports coverages. Have you looked at this question? Do you have a view on this question?
Well, I haven't looked at this in my research, but there have been some researchers that have looked at, particularly in Canada, at violence in hockey games. And some of the results are kind of interesting. They suggest the following model, that what's most important is the kind of violence appearing in sporting events that can be carried over into everyday life. Fights in hockey games stimulate aggressive behavior more than anything else.
In an effort to summarize, let me try to say the following. There is a correlation between aggression and television, but is it a causal connection? The best studies seem to disagree on this. You've heard that disagreement. Even if the connection is causal, how much aggression in total does it explain? It probably explains only a little, but that small part could be important. And the question is whether the aggression also displayed by children is related to later serious crime. It may be, it may not be. The results are clearly not in. There is certainly an imitative effect, but the question then is this imitative effect only short-lived? Probably the answer is yes. Thank you for joining me, gentlemen, and ladies and gentlemen, for Crime File, thank you for watching. I'm James Wilson.
Funding for this program was provided by the National Institute of Justice. This program was produced by the Police Foundation, which is solely responsible for its content.